1944. Somewhere in the heart of the American Midwest. The war in Europe raged on, but here, behind tall fences lined with barbed wire, the sound of gunfire was replaced by something unexpected: laughter. The evening sun dipped low, painting the horizon gold as a gentle breeze carried the aroma of roasted meat and freshly baked bread across the camp. For the men who once marched beneath the banner of the Reich, it was a scent they hadn't known in years. The scent of home, of warmth, of humanity. Inside the American POW camp, dozens of German prisoners stood in quiet disbelief. Their uniforms were worn, their faces tired from years of war and surrender. Yet tonight, something was different. The guards didn't shout. Instead, they smiled, motioning toward long wooden tables laid out beneath the open sky. Plates were already set, real plates, not tin mess kits, and on them rested generous servings of food: tender beef stew, buttered corn, and slices of soft white bread that glowed under lantern light. For the first time since they'd left home, the prisoners didn't feel like enemies. They felt human. The clatter of spoons, the faint music from a nearby radio, and the quiet murmur of men giving thanks in different tongues filled the air. Many of them would whisper later, with tears in their eyes, "We never ate like this back home." They had marched through mud, frost, and fire. They had seen their comrades vanish in the chaos of shells, their uniforms torn, their stomachs hollow, their spirits worn down to the bone. For years, survival had meant clinging to the edge of hunger. And now, as the war's tide turned against them, and surrender became the only escape, these men found themselves far from the ruined cities of Europe, behind the fences of an American prisoner, of war camp deep in the heartland. It was the spring of 1944. The days were longer now, the air thick with the scent of grass and soil awakening from winter's grip. But the prisoners were slow to notice it. They were still living in the shadows of the battlefields they had left behind. For many of them, the journey to this place had been a blur. Captured in North Africa, Sicily or France, shipped across the Atlantic in massive convoys, they had landed in a country they barely understood. America was supposed to be the enemy, faceless, distant, brutal. Yet when they arrived, exhausted and silent, they were not met with fists or rifles, but with order, discipline, and something far more disarming: calm. The camp stood neat and well kept, its wooden barracks arranged in rows, its fences stretching in tidy symmetry beneath the vast open sky. There was no smoke from burning cities, no thunder of artillery. Only the low hum of cicadas, the rhythm of boots on gravel, and the occasional bark of orders that sounded almost polite. The guards watched carefully, rifles slung but not raised. The prisoners, unsure of what to expect, carried with them the same wary posture they had worn in battle. They waited for cruelty. Instead, they were given soap, clean uniforms, and beds with real blankets. That first evening, as the sun began to sink beyond the horizon, a call went out: dinner time. The Germans exchanged glances. Dinner. The word felt foreign in their mouths, heavy with disbelief. Back home, during the last months of the war, meals had become smaller, thinner, more desperate. Bread was rationed, meat a distant memory. They had grown used to the ache of emptiness that followed every bite. So, when they saw the long wooden tables being laid out in the camp square, curiosity warred with caution. Steam rose from large metal pots carried by American kitchen staff. The air was suddenly rich with a smell that struck the prisoners like a forgotten dream. Onions sautéed in butter, meat simmering slowly, bread fresh from the oven. It was impossible not to react. Heads turned, nostrils flared. Some men swallowed hard, others whispered to each other, uncertain whether this was real. The guards simply stood nearby, expressionless, their rifles slung casually across their shoulders as if to say, "Yes, it's for you." When the prisoners were finally called forward, they walked hesitantly toward the tables. Their steps were slow, measured, like men afraid to wake from a dream. Each held a tin plate, expecting the usual thin soup or hard crusts that had defined their days at the front. But when ladles dipped into the pots and poured out thick, hearty stew filled with chunks of beef and potatoes, many of them just stared. For a moment, no one moved. The sound of spoons clinking echoed softly in the evening air. One of the American cooks, a young corporal from Kansas, offered a small smile as he handed out bread, still warm, its crust crackling slightly in the cool air. "Eat up," he said simply, his voice carrying no malice. The Germans nodded mutely. Some whispered dank. Others remained silent, afraid to break the fragile peace of the moment. They took their places on the benches, eyes darting toward the guards, half expecting this kindness to dissolve into mockery. But the Americans said nothing more. They simply stood watch, letting the men eat. For the first time in years, the Germans were not soldiers, not captives, not enemies, just human beings with hunger in their bellies and fatigue in their bones. The first spoonful silenced every whisper. It was warm, flavorful, and real. Not the tasteless sludge of ration tins, but a meal cooked with patience, seasoned with salt and care. The taste brought memories rushing back, of mothers stirring pots in small kitchens, of laughter drifting through open windows, of peace. Some men closed their eyes as they chewed, as if holding on to that sensation might transport them home. As they ate, the camp began to change around them. The hard lines between captor and captive softened. The sound of boots on gravel faded beneath the clatter of utensils and the soft murmur of voices. Someone laughed quietly. Another hummed a tune under his breath, the melody of a song long banned under the weight of war. Across the fence, the American guards exchanged quiet glances, not of suspicion, but of understanding. They too were young men, far from home, yearning for something simple and human in a world torn apart. When a second ladle of stew was offered, many hesitated before accepting. It felt wrong to take more than what necessity allowed. Yet the cook nodded encouragingly. "There's plenty," he said. And so they ate again, slower this time, savoring each bite as though it might be their last moment of normalcy before waking to war once more. In the fading light, a radio played softly from the guard post, an old American tune filled with violins and nostalgia. The prisoners listened. Some recognized the rhythm, though not the words. Others simply sat in silence, the music filling the spaces that language could not. For a brief hour, the camp became something else entirely, not a prison, but a fragile sanctuary of decency amid chaos. When the meal was finished, the men lingered. A few cleaned their plates meticulously, not wanting to waste even a crumb. One man, a former baker from Hamburg, stared at the bread in his hands as though it was sacred. "We never ate like this back home," he murmured, not to anyone in particular. The words carried softly on the wind and seemed to settle over the camp like a benediction. The guards began to collect the dishes, moving among the prisoners without tension. There were no shouts, no blows, only the quiet rustle of fabric, the soft scrape of tin on wood. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed, a reminder that the world beyond the fence was still burning. But inside, there was peace, fragile and fleeting though it might be. That night, as they lay in their bunks, the prisoners spoke in low voices. They talked about the food, about the strange kindness of their captors, about what their families might think if they knew. Some wept quietly into their blankets, overwhelmed not by fear or guilt, but by the unbearable gentleness of it all. For years, they had been taught that compassion was weakness. Tonight, they learned it could be strength. And so, the dinner became more than sustenance. It became a turning point. For men stripped of everything, it restored a sliver of dignity, a glimpse of the humanity they thought the war had extinguished. They did not know how long this decency would last or what tomorrow would bring. But for one evening, in an American camp far from the ashes of Europe, They remembered what it felt like to be men, not soldiers. As the lights dimmed and silence settled over the camp, one could almost imagine that the fences were not there, that the war was a nightmare fading into dawn. But even through the wire, even under the weight of captivity, something had changed. The simple act of being fed, of being seen as human, had left a mark deeper than hunger ever could. For many, that dinner would remain etched in memory for the rest of their lives. They would speak of it years later, their voices trembling with age, recalling not the taste of the stew or the bread, but the feeling, the quiet shock of kindness in a world that had forgotten how to be kind. They would remember the golden light of sunset, the smell of warm bread, and the American soldier's calm voice saying, "Eat up." In that moment, the distance between enemies collapsed. Two worlds touched, briefly, over a shared meal, and in that contact, something fragile yet indestructible was born. It was not victory or surrender, but understanding, and it began, as many small miracles do, with the simple breaking of bread. The night came quietly over the camp, soft and slow, as if reluctant to disturb the peace that had settled there. The last rays of sun faded into deep blue shadows, and one by one, the lanterns flickered to life, casting golden halos on the wooden tables. The smell of cooked food still lingered in the air. Faint now, but comforting, a reminder of the meal that had changed the mood of the entire place. The German prisoners sat together in small groups, their faces calm, some leaning forward with elbows on the table, others leaning back against the rough wood of the benches, their bodies finally relaxed. The tension that had once clung to them like another layer of uniform seemed to melt away with each passing minute. They spoke softly at first, their voices barely audible over the hum of insects and the crackle of a nearby fire. It began with simple words, a few comments about the stew, the bread, the strange gentleness of the American cooks. Then the conversations grew, reaching further, deeper into the places they had long avoided. One man mentioned his mother's kitchen in Bavaria, the smell of rye bread and the sound of rain tapping on the windows. Another spoke about his father's farm, about the horses he'd left behind, and how he sometimes dreamed of brushing their manes again. These were not soldiers now. These were sons, brothers, husbands, human beings caught in a world that had taught them to forget their humanity. Across from them, an American guard leaned casually on his rifle, listening without understanding the words, but recognizing the tone, that quiet nostalgia that every man at war carries. He didn't interrupt. He simply watched the flames dance, his expression thoughtful. He was young too, maybe 22, maybe 23, and though he'd never seen a battlefield, he could sense the weight of what these men had endured. The campfire's light played across their faces, carving deep shadows into their tired features. It made their eyes gleam, eyes that had once stared into gunfire, now reflecting only the calm pulse of firelight. The night was cool but not cold. The breeze that moved through the camp carried with it the faint scent of pine and soil. For the first time in a long while, the air did not smell of smoke or blood. It smelled alive. One prisoner reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. The edges were frayed. The image faded, but the figure of a smiling woman could still be seen holding a child. He set it gently on the table, tracing the outline with a calloused finger. Another man beside him glanced down, nodded quietly, and pulled out his own, a picture of two boys standing in a field of tall grass. Soon, others did the same. Within minutes, the table was covered in tiny windows to other lives. Wives, children, parents, lovers, frozen moments from a world far away. There was no laughter then, only silence, not the uneasy silence of fear, but the kind that holds reverence. The Americans saw the photos too, some stepping closer to look. One of the cooks, wiping his hands on a towel, leaned over and said softly, "She's beautiful." The German nodded once, unable to answer, eyes wet but unashamed. For a while, they simply sat together, separated by language but not by emotion. It was a strange thing, the kind of stillness that makes time feel suspended. The sound of cutlery being washed somewhere in the distance echoed faintly, but no one paid attention. The fire cracked again, a spark shooting upward and fading into the dark. The world for that brief night seemed to have forgotten war. Then someone began to hum. It was barely a whisper, a tune slow and old, one of those melodies that linger like a ghost from childhood. Another voice joined, and then another, until half a dozen men were humming together. The song was German, but its tone was universal, full of longing, sorrow, and hope intertwined. The Americans listened silently. One of them, moved by something he couldn't name, walked back to the radio shack and turned the knob until a soft tune drifted through the static. It wasn't the same melody, but somehow it fit, violins and brass rising gently into the night. Two worlds, two songs, blending for a moment into one fragile harmony. The prisoners smiled faintly. Some stared into the fire, others closed their eyes. There was no command here, no discipline, no ideology, only men remembering what it meant to feel something pure. The food had filled their stomachs, but it was the kindness that filled something deeper. They had been told the enemy would break them, humiliate them, treat them as less than men. But the Americans had done something far more dangerous. They had treated them with respect. For a man who has spent years in fear and obedience, mercy can be terrifying. It breaks the walls built around the heart. That night, those walls began to crumble. The bread, the stew, the simple act of being served rather than punished. These were gestures so small, yet they carried the power to undo years of hatred. Each bite had been a quiet revelation, each word exchanged across the fire a bridge rebuilt. A few of the prisoners began to talk about the future, not the war, not the rage, but what might come after. Would they ever go home? Would there be a home to return to? One man spoke of his village, now reduced to rubble by air raids. Another whispered that he had no one left. There was a long pause after that, the silence heavy but not empty. The American cook, the one from Kansas, reached out and slid a second slice of bread toward him. No words were spoken. They weren't needed. As the night deepened, the prisoners leaned closer to the fire. The light painted their faces in gold and orange, softening the harsh lines of exhaustion. The shadows of the barbed wire stretched long across the ground, but beyond it, the stars glittered with quiet indifference. The same stars the prisoners' families might be looking at halfway across the world. It was strange to think that even the sky could be shared between enemies. One of the older soldiers, his hair graying beneath his cap, finally spoke. "You know," he said in a low voice, "I used to think Americans were savages. That's what they told us. But look at this." He gestured toward the fire, toward the faces glowing in its light. "This is not what I was told." The others nodded slowly. The myths of war, the dehumanizing stories that make killing easier, had begun to fade. Reality was far more complicated. In that moment, they realized something profound, that their captors had nothing to gain from kindness. They had already won the battle. Yet here they were, sharing warmth, food, and small mercy. It was not victory that made them generous. It was character. And for the prisoners, that realization stung more deeply than defeat ever could. The American guards didn't know they were changing lives that night. To them, it was just another duty, another evening meal. But for the men behind the wire, it was the first glimpse of a world where humanity mattered more than flags. When the fire began to die down, the conversations grew quieter. Some men stood and walked toward their barracks, their footsteps soft on the dirt. Others stayed, watching the embers collapse into glowing ash. A few remained long after midnight, staring at the last flickers of flame as though afraid that if they looked away, the peace would vanish too. Inside the barracks, the air was warm. The prisoners lay on their bunks, still tasting the salt of the stew, the butter on the bread. Their bodies were tired, but their minds were alive. Some thought about their families. Others replayed the evening's small moments. The sound of the radio, the look in the cook's eyes, the faint hum of a song that would follow them for years. One man whispered into the dark, "They treated us better than our own leaders ever did." No one answered, but in the silence everyone agreed. For years they had been instruments of war. Tonight they were simply men who had eaten, talked, and remembered what compassion felt like. It was an ordinary meal, yet extraordinary in what it meant. For them, it redefined the enemy. It dissolved, even if briefly, the barriers built by politics and propaganda. They had learned that mercy could wound and heal at the same time. Wound the pride of soldiers trained to see kindness as weakness, and heal the parts of their souls that had gone numb. By the time the camp fell completely silent, the fire outside had gone out. Only the faint glow of the moon lit the yard. Somewhere, a guard yawned and shifted his weight. An owl hooted in the distance. The night felt timeless, suspended between war and peace, cruelty and compassion. No one slept easily. They were full, but restless, as if their minds were digesting something far heavier than food. It was not just the dinner they had been given, it was the idea that humanity still existed. For men who had seen so much of its absence, that was almost unbearable. And yet, in the stillness before dawn, something fragile stirred, a hope that perhaps not all was lost, that maybe the world could begin again, one act of decency at a time. The dawn came softly, spilling gold across the horizon and filtering through the thin fabric of the barracks. The camp was still. Only the distant call of a bird and the faint clatter of a metal pail broke the silence. For the German prisoners waking that morning, the world felt different. Not freer, not easier, but changed in a quiet, unspoken way. The smell of smoke still lingered from the fires of the night before, and somewhere a pot of coffee brewed for the guards. Yet what stayed most in their minds was not the food or the firelight. It was the feeling that had lingered long after the last bowl had been emptied. Something had shifted inside them, something they couldn't quite name. The night's meal had touched places within them that war had buried. For years, they had been taught to harden themselves, to trust no one, to see mercy as weakness. The regime that had led them across continents had taken pride in erasing tenderness from their hearts. But that one dinner, simple, honest, undeserved, had undone some of that cruelty. They couldn't stop thinking about it. They could still see the faces of the Americans, the calm in their eyes, the way they spoke without hatred. It wasn't pity, it was respect. And for men who had been stripped of dignity, respect was nourishment greater than any meal. Outside, the sun climbed higher, cutting through the mist that hung over the camp like breath on glass. The wooden fences gleamed faintly with dew. A few prisoners stood silently by the wire, looking out at the fields beyond. The grass was long, wet, and shining. For a moment, if they blurred their eyes, they could almost imagine they were back in Europe, on farms, in open meadows, where life had once been simple and untouched by the machinery of death. But then they would glance at the guard towers, the rifles, the silent sentries, and the illusion would fade. Yet even here, surrounded by wire and watchful eyes, the feeling of that dinner stayed with them. It had been an unexpected mercy, a gift they hadn't earned. It made them question everything they had been told. If the enemy could show kindness, then what had they been fighting for? The thought was dangerous, treacherous even, but it refused to leave. They had seen the propaganda posters, the speeches, the orders shouted by men in black uniforms. But none of that could erase the image of an American cook smiling as he handed over a ladle of stew. Some of the younger prisoners talked about it quietly as they worked in the camp gardens. They had been sent out to dig, to plant, to repair fences. The work was steady, rhythmic, grounding. Between shovels and sweat, words slipped out in low tones. "Did you see how they served us?" one said. "Like equals." Another nodded, still swinging his spade. "I haven't seen food like that since before the war." A third, quieter than the rest, muttered, "I didn't think they'd treat us like that. Not after everything." No one responded. They didn't need to. The Americans kept to their routines, checking the fences, logging supplies, keeping order. To them, it was another day. But to the prisoners, the camp no longer felt as hostile. It was still confinement, yes, but now it carried an unfamiliar sense of peace. They began to notice small things. The way the guards offered water when the sun grew harsh, the way the cooks sometimes saved extra bread for those who worked hardest. Someone, somewhere, would show his family the same mercy. Days turned into weeks, and the story of that night spread through the camp like an invisible current. Men who hadn't been there heard it from those who had. The taste of the stew, the bread, the silence, the strange peace that had settled over everyone. They spoke of it as though it had been a vision, a dream that reminded them what the world could still be. One never ate like that back home. They would repeat, half in wonder, half in sorrow. Over time, that simple act began to soften the prisoners themselves. Fights among them became rare. The bitterness that once filled their conversations gave way to reflection. Some began to help the American staff willingly, mending fences, tending crops, fixing roofs. It wasn't obedience anymore, it was participation. They were still prisoners, but no longer broken. One American sergeant later wrote in his diary, "It's strange. They came to us with hate in their eyes, and now they nod when they pass. Sometimes I think we're all just trying to survive the same war, each in our own way." He didn't know that many of the prisoners were writing the same thing in their own journals. That the Americans had shown them more decency than the men who once led them. The meal had become legend within the wire, a turning point whispered about during long evenings. To the Germans, it wasn't just food. It was redemption in the smallest, most human form. They began to believe that perhaps goodness wasn't lost forever. That even after the ruins, something kind could still remain. Years later, when the war was over and they returned home, many of them would tell their families about it. They would describe the night in vivid detail. The glow of lanterns, the warmth of stew, the calm voice of an American saying, "Eat up." They would pause then, their eyes distant, remembering the way their hearts had trembled. That night, one veteran said decades later, "I realized I had been wrong about everything. They were supposed to be our enemies, but they treated us like men. I think that was the moment the war truly ended for me." And perhaps that was the truth of it. Wars end not with treaties or surrenders, but in quiet moments when one man chooses mercy over vengeance. In that American camp, far from the front lines, such a moment had taken place. Small enough to go unnoticed by history, yet powerful enough to echo in the hearts of the way music floated from the radio near the command office during the evenings. That night's dinner had started something subtle, a bridge between two worlds that had every reason to hate each other. The prisoners began to see their captors not as faceless uniforms, but as men. They started to wave when they passed each other, to share small gestures, a nod, a word, a moment of silent acknowledgement. War had divided them by orders and flags, but humanity was stitching them back together in invisible threads. For some, the experience was overwhelming. One man, a former officer who had commanded a tank unit in North Africa, sat by himself that afternoon, staring at the dirt under his boots. He was a man who had lived by rules, by strength, by cold efficiency. Yet now, that strength felt hollow. The stew had been simple, but its warmth haunted him more than any battle he had fought. It wasn't the food itself, but the meaning behind it, that compassion could survive amid chaos. It made him realize something painful, that the war had stolen not only his country's honor, but his own ability to feel. When evening fell again, and the prisoners gathered near the fence for roll call, the mood was quieter. The light was soft, the air cool. The Americans read names, counted heads, gave short instructions. Everything was routine, yet under that routine lay something unspoken. Each man there carried in his chest a fragile ember of understanding, one that glowed when he remembered the faces of his captors serving him food without malice. That ember was dangerous in its own way. It had the power to burn away hatred, and once hatred was gone, obedience began to falter. Inside the barracks that night, a few of the men wrote in small notebooks, fragments of letters they might send home one day. "They treat us well," one wrote. "Better than I imagined." Another wrote simply, "I am alive, and there is kindness here." These letters, if they ever reached Germany, would confuse the families who read them. How could kindness exist in the enemy's camp? Yet it did, quietly, defiantly, like a candle flickering in a storm. For others, the memory of the dinner stirred guilt. How could they enjoy food when their comrades were starving on the Eastern Front, or when their own families hid from bombs in ruined cities? The thought gnawed at them. One man refused his portion the next day, saying softly, "I can't, not while they suffer." But even he could not erase the gratitude that had taken root in him. He prayed that one day those who lived it. When dawn broke again the next morning, the camp stirred as it always did. The prisoners lined up, the guards made their rounds, the cooks prepared breakfast. Life continued, but beneath its rhythm was a pulse of understanding that humanity, once shown, could never be forgotten. The fences still stood, but they no longer felt like the walls they once were. Beyond them lay the vast American landscape, endless, green, and free, and though the prisoners could not cross it, they had glimpsed something even greater, the possibility of peace. And so, years after the guns fell silent, when the world tried to rebuild from its ruins, those men carried with them not only memories of war, but of that dinner, of bread and kindness, of enemies who had become, if only for one night, fellow men. In their hearts, they knew what they had learned could not be taught in battlefields or politics. It could only be learned around a table, under lantern light, when hunger met mercy and hatred bowed its head in silence.